I was pulling weeds along the front walk when my daughter-in-law's car turned into the driveway at a speed that made my stomach drop. She never drives like that. Fiona is the kind of woman who signals 3 blocks early and keeps both hands on the wheel. She taught herself to drive at 32 because she was terrified of highways. So when I saw her brake hard enough to throw gravel against the garage door, I dropped my gloves and was moving before the car even stopped. She didn't get out right away. That's what I remember. The engine cut off and nothing happened for a few seconds, and those few seconds felt very long. When the door finally opened, she was holding onto it to stand up. Her blouse was torn at the shoulder. There was mud on her knees. And her face? I won't forget her face. She looked like someone who had been crying for so long she'd gone somewhere past crying, somewhere very quiet and very frightened. I got to her before she could take 2 steps. She said my name, just my name, and then her knees buckled and I caught her, this woman who had been part of my family for 11 years, and I held her up in my driveway in Guelph on a Tuesday afternoon and felt something cold settle in my chest that I knew was going to be there for a long time. She told me I had no right to be in that family. She said everything wrong in Xavier's life started with me. She meant my daughter-in-law's mother-in-law. She meant my son's mother. She meant Lorraine. I need to back up. Xavier is my son. He's 41 now, and he works in commercial insurance, and he is, in most ways I can measure, a decent man. He was raised to be kind. I made sure of it after his father left because I knew what it cost a child to grow up in a house where cruelty was considered normal. I raised him alone from the time he was 9, and I did not do it perfectly, but I did it with everything I had. When he was 30, he met Fiona at a conference in Ottawa. She was working in public health then, coordinating vaccination outreach in rural communities, driving long distances in winter, staying in motels that smelled like carpet cleaner. She was the kind of person who did the work nobody else wanted to do and didn't complain about it. I liked her immediately. Not just because of what she did for a living, but because of how she spoke about it. Like it was just the obvious thing. Like there was no other option. They married 2 years later. Small ceremony, Stanley Park, just family and close friends. Fiona's family flew in from New Brunswick. Her parents, her younger sister, and aunt she was close to. They were warm people. Her mother pressed my hands when we met and said she was grateful our children had found each other. For 9 years, things were good. Not perfect. Xavier works too much and Fiona carries more than her share at home, and I have said so to both of them, but good. Real. The kind of marriage that has texture to it. Then Xavier's biological father came back. I should explain. Xavier's father and I separated when Xavier was 9. He had a second family by the time Xavier was in university. A woman he'd met through work, children who were now grown, a whole other life. Xavier had limited contact with him over the years. A few awkward lunches, a graduation card, nothing sustained. I never spoke badly about him to Xavier. I kept my feelings in a drawer and locked it and swallowed the key. It seemed like the right thing to do at the time. I'm less certain now. His father retired last year. Moved from Calgary to a suburb outside of Hamilton to be closer to Xavier and, I suspect, because he wanted to feel like a father, in a way he'd never bothered to be when it mattered. He brought his wife. Her name is Lorraine. I met Lorraine twice before the trouble started. Once at a dinner Xavier organized, all of us awkward around a table at a restaurant in Burlington, everyone trying too hard. And once at a birthday gathering at Xavier and Fiona's house in the spring. Both times, she was pleasant in that deliberate way that takes effort. The kind of pleasant that is performing something. What I didn't know, what none of us knew until later, was what she was saying to Xavier when it was just the two of them. Fiona told me, that afternoon in the driveway, that it had been going on for months. Lorraine would visit when Fiona was at work and she'd talk to Xavier for hours. About the past, about his father's sacrifices, about how Xavier had turned out well in spite of his upbringing, not because of it. She told him I had been bitter and difficult, that I had poisoned him against his father, that Fiona was cold and controlling and had isolated Xavier from his real family. His real family. That's the phrase she used. as though 11 years could be erased by a woman he'd known for 8 months. I didn't know any of this when Fiona arrived at my house that day. What I knew was that she was hurt, and she was scared, and she needed someone to sit her down and get her a glass of water and let her talk. So that's what I did. I brought her inside. My house is small. I downsized when Xavier left for university and never went back to anything bigger. 2 bedrooms, a garden out back, a kitchen I've cooked in for 22 years. She sat at my kitchen table where she'd sat 100 times before, and I put the kettle on, and I sat across from her and I waited. She told me that Lorraine had called her that morning. Not texted, called, and said that she wanted to meet, that there were things that needed to be said. Fiona had agreed because she is someone who believes in dealing with things directly, which is one of the things I've always admired about her. They met at a cafe in Ancaster. Fiona drove 40 minutes. Lorraine was already there when she arrived. She had brought a folder, an actual folder with documents in it. Fiona said she sat down and Lorraine pushed the folder across the table and said, "I think you should read these before we talk." Inside were printouts of emails between Xavier and his father going back almost a year. In the emails, Xavier described arguments with Fiona, frustrations with her work schedule, disagreements about money, a comment she'd made about his father that he'd apparently found hurtful. Normal marriage friction, the kind every couple has, written down in moments of venting and now being used as evidence. Evidence of what? Fiona asked. Evidence, Lorraine said, that the marriage was struggling. Evidence that Fiona was the source of that struggle. And then Lorraine leaned forward over her coffee and said the words that brought Fiona to my driveway at that speed. She said, "Xavier's father and I have spoken with a lawyer. If you're planning to have children, I want you to know we will be involved. We have rights. And frankly, Fiona, someone needs to think about what kind of environment a child would be raised in, with a mother who puts her career above her family." Fiona was not pregnant. There was no child. Lorraine had simply decided to make a preemptive strike at a future that hadn't happened yet. And then Lorraine had said, and this is the part Fiona couldn't finish without her voice breaking. She said, "My husband made mistakes when Xavier was young, but he had to deal with a very bitter, very difficult woman. I hope Xavier doesn't have to do the same." She met me. She was talking about me to my daughter-in-law in a cafe over a folder of private emails, and she was using me as a warning. I sat across from Fiona and I kept my face very calm because I have had 63 years of practice at keeping my face calm when what I want to do is put my fist through something. I said, "Does Xavier know she did this?" Fiona said she didn't know. She'd left the cafe and driven straight to me. I said, "Okay, drink your tea. We're going to figure this out." That night, after Fiona went home, I called my younger sister. My sister's name is Brenda. She's 58 and she lives in Waterloo, and she is one of those people who can see to the bottom of a situation almost immediately. She worked for 30 years in family law as a paralegal, and she retired 2 years ago, and she says retirement is boring, and she says this while doing more in a month than most people do in a year. She has never been afraid of anyone. I told her everything. She listened without interrupting, which is how I knew she was taking it seriously. When I finished, she said, "Those emails. Xavier didn't give them to Lorraine." I said I didn't think so. She said, "Then how did she get them?" That was the question. That was the one that kept me awake until 2 in the morning. The next day I called Xavier. It was a hard phone call to make. Not because I was afraid of him, but because I didn't want to be the one to crack something open that couldn't be put back together. I'm his mother. I spent decades trying to protect him from hard things, and then spent more decades learning that protecting people from hard things is sometimes the same as lying to them. I told him I'd spoken with Fiona. I told him what Lorraine had said in the cafe. I kept my voice neutral and I used plain words and I did not editorialize. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "She wasn't supposed to do that." Those 5 words. I said, "Xavier, did you know she was going to talk to Fiona?" He said, "Not like that. Not with the—" I didn't know about the folder. So he knew some of it. He had talked to his father and Lorraine about his marriage. He had shared private things and either hadn't understood or hadn't wanted to understand what Lorraine might do with them. I didn't yell. I want to be clear about that because I know how it sounds and I know what people assume about mothers and sons and old grievances. I didn't yell. I said, "You need to talk to your wife." He said, "I know." I said, "Today." "Not this weekend." "Today." He said, "I know, Mom." And then I said the other thing, the harder thing. "Xavier, I need you to understand that what that woman did is not something a person does when they have good intentions. She came to your wife with a folder of your private correspondence, and she implied that I was the reason your father failed as a parent. Those are not the actions of someone who loves you. Those are the actions of someone who is managing you." Another long silence. He said, "That's a strong word." I said, "Yes, it is. I'm 63 years old and I'm your mother and I love you and I'm telling you this because no one else will." After we hung up, I sat in my kitchen for a while. I looked at the garden through the back window. I'd planted a row of late-season asters that were just coming up along the fence, purple and rust-colored, very pretty. I thought about the 22 years I'd spent in that kitchen making lunches and doing homework help and getting through month ends when the numbers were tight and the city wasn't plowing the streets properly and the furnace was making a sound that worried me. I thought about Fiona in that cafe, sitting across from a woman she'd tried to meet in good faith, opening a folder of her own marriage being used against her. I thought about Lorraine saying my name, using me as an instrument. I picked up the phone and called my sister back. Brenda came over on Saturday. She brought her laptop and a notepad and a very good bottle of Niagara Red, and she sat at my kitchen table, and we talked for 4 hours. The emails were the thing. We kept coming back to the emails. Xavier and his father used a shared cloud account for some files. They'd set it up when Xavier was first reconnecting with his father, something about sharing old photos. Xavier had apparently used the same password for his personal email that he used for the shared account. His father had guessed it or tried it, or Brenda's theory, Lorraine had noticed it and figured it out herself. Either way, they had access they shouldn't have had. Brenda said, in Ontario, that's not nothing. Accessing someone's private email without consent is a serious issue, civilly and potentially otherwise. I said I wasn't sure I wanted to go that route. She said, "I'm not saying you should. I'm saying you should know that you could, and I'm saying that Lorraine should know that you know that." That was the piece I'd been missing. Not what to do, what to hold. The following week, Fiona and Xavier came to dinner, together. That was a good sign. Xavier looked like a man who hadn't been sleeping well, which I understood and didn't comment on. Fiona looked steadier than she had in my driveway, but there was something careful in how she moved. The way you move when something still hurts and you're being very deliberate about not showing it. I made pot roast. It seemed like the right kind of meal. Simple, warm, something that takes time and tastes like it. After dinner, after the dishes were cleared, Xavier said, "I talked to Dad." I waited. He said he didn't know she'd brought the folder. He knew she was meeting Fiona, but he said he thought it was going to be a friendly coffee. Fiona made a sound beside him that she covered quickly. Xavier said, "I told him what she said. About you. And about Fiona and the children comment." His jaw was tight. He said he'd talk to her. I said, "Is that enough for you?" He looked at me. I said, "I'm asking genuinely. Is that enough for you?" He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "No, I don't think it is." Brenda had helped me draft a letter. We'd spent an evening on it. It was not threatening. It was factual. It outlined what had occurred, named the emails and how they had likely been accessed, noted that Fiona had felt her safety and her future had been implicitly threatened, and stated clearly that any further contact between Lorraine and Fiona would need to go through a neutral third party. We'd had a lawyer friend look it over before we sent it. She'd made 2 changes and said the rest was solid. I gave a copy of the letter to Xavier and I told him what it said, and I told him he could read it before I sent anything because this was his life and his father and I was not going to act without him knowing. He read it. He sat with it for a long time. Then he said, "Send it." Brenda had a contact, a woman she'd worked with for years in family law in Kitchener, who agreed to review everything on a consulting basis. She was the one who sent the letter on her letterhead, which made it land differently than it would have coming from me. Lorraine responded through her own lawyer 4 days later. Her response was what Brenda had expected, a denial, a characterization of the meeting as a concerned conversation, a suggestion that Fiona had misunderstood the tone. There was no apology. There was no acknowledgement of the emails. But she didn't escalate. That was the thing. She had the option to, and she didn't. Brenda said, "She knows she's exposed. She's pulling back." The months after that were not easy. Xavier and his father were in a strained place for a long time. His father called me once, in the autumn, from a cell number I didn't recognize. He said he was sorry. He said he hadn't realized what Lorraine had been doing. He said he'd tried to talk to her and that it had been very difficult. I said, "I believe you." I'm not sure I meant it completely, but I said it, and after I hung up, I thought about it, and the more I thought about it, the more I decided it was worth believing. Not for him. For me. Because I am 63 and I have spent enough of my life being angry at that man, and I do not have unlimited energy, and I need to spend it on things that matter. What matters is Fiona. What matters is Xavier finding his footing. What matters is this. At Christmas, 3 months after all of it, Fiona pulled me aside in the kitchen while the others were in the living room, and she held my hands the same way her mother had held mine at that wedding in Stanley Park. She said, "I want you to know that when I didn't know where else to go, I came to you. And that tells me something." I said, "It tells me something too." We stood there in my kitchen for a moment, the two of us, with the sound of the others in the next room. Through the window, I could see snow coming down soft over the backyard, over the asters that had gone brown for winter, over the fence I'd painted myself 3 summers ago. She said, "I'm pregnant." I had to sit down. She laughed for the first time in months, a real laugh, sudden and unguarded, and she sat down beside me at the table where she'd been crying 6 months before. I said, "How far?" She said, 14 weeks. We wanted to wait. I said, "Does Xavier's father know?" She said, "Does Xavier's father know?" She said, "Not yet. And we're going to tell him on our terms, with Xavier there." And she paused. "We've decided that Lorraine won't be at the birth, or at the house after. That's our boundary." Xavier agreed. I said, "That's your right." She said, "I know, but I wanted you to know, because you—" She stopped. "You didn't tell me what to feel or what to do. You just stayed." That's the whole of it, really. That's what I want to say to anyone who asks me what happened. I stayed. I kept the drawer locked. I made pot roast. I helped my sister. I sent the letter. I believed what was worth believing, and I let the rest go. Not because it didn't matter, but because I've learned, slowly, over a long time, and not without cost, that the work of protecting the people you love is mostly quiet. It doesn't look like revenge. It doesn't look like anything dramatic. It looks like a woman standing in her driveway, catching someone who is falling. It looks like tea in a kitchen when there's nothing else to offer. It looks like staying. The baby is due in June. We don't know yet if it's a girl or a boy. Fiona says she wants to be surprised. I think she's right. Some things are better when they're not planned for. I've started a small blanket. Pale yellow, because it works for either. My mother taught me how to knit in this same kitchen, at this same table, when I was about 8 years old. She had very patient hands. I hope I've inherited that. I think for the first time in a long while, that I have. I've been thinking about what it actually means to protect someone. Not in the big dramatic sense, not the kind of protection that makes a good movie, but the ordinary kind. The kind that doesn't look like anything from the outside. When Fiona pulled into my driveway that afternoon, I didn't know yet what had happened. I just saw the way she braked, and I knew something was wrong, and I moved. That's all it was. I moved toward her instead of waiting to understand first. I think that instinct, to move toward, not away, is something that gets built over a long time, through small choices you don't even notice you're making. Lorraine made choices too. She chose to collect those emails. She chose to put them in a folder. She chose to sit across from Fiona in that cafe and use them as leverage against a woman who had driven 40 minutes in good faith. Every one of those choices had a consequence. She probably didn't calculate, because people who operate the way Lorraine operates rarely do. They're focused on the short move, not the long one. They don't see that what they're actually building is a record of themselves, not a case against someone else, a record of who they are. By the time we sent that letter, Lorraine had no good options. Not because we'd been clever, though Brenda certainly was, but because Lorraine had spent months making choices that couldn't be undone. The emails she'd accessed, the things she'd said in that cafe, the way she'd used me as a cautionary tale to frighten a woman she barely knew, all of it was already in the room before the letter arrived. We just named it. That's what I want to say about how things unfold between people. It's not mysterious, it's accumulated. What you do quietly, over time, in the moments you think no one is keeping track of, that is what eventually becomes the situation you're standing in. Lorraine stood in a situation entirely of her own construction, and so, in a different way, did I. I chose, 30 years ago, not to speak badly about Xavier's father. Not because I didn't want to. I did, badly, in those first years. But because I understood, somewhere beneath the anger, that Xavier would need to make his own assessment of that man. My job was to stay out of the way of that assessment, not to predetermine it. It cost me something to stay quiet. I want to be honest about that. It was not noble. It was a grinding daily decision that often felt like swallowing something sharp. But it meant that when Lorraine tried to characterize me as bitter and difficult, she was working against 30 years of evidence that said otherwise. Xavier knew who I was. Fiona knew who I was. The characterization didn't stick because there was nothing for it to stick to. That's the thing about how a person's character actually functions in a crisis. It's not what you say in the moment, it's what you've been doing all along that suddenly becomes relevant. I think about Brenda, showing up on Saturday with her laptop and her notepad and that bottle of Niagara Red. She didn't have to come. She's retired. She has her own life. She could have offered advice by phone. She came because that's what she's always done. Shown up, stayed practical, refused to panic. Decades of being that kind of person meant that when I needed someone beside me, I knew exactly who to call, and I knew she would come. The baby blanket is sitting on the chair beside my bed right now. Pale yellow. I've got about a third of it done. Some nights, I knit a few rows and I think about June and about Fiona holding that baby and about Xavier becoming a father in a way his own father never managed to be. And I think about how none of it was guaranteed. It required people to make hard choices, to stay when it would have been easier to leave, to say the true thing when it would have been easier to stay quiet. I am 63 years old. I have made enough mistakes to understand that this is the only real measure of a life, not the dramatic moments, the ordinary ones. What you do when it's Tuesday afternoon and someone is falling and you happen to be standing close enough to catch them. That's all it ever is. Being close enough and choosing to catch.